Popular songs are a cultural footprint of a generation's woes and beliefs, loves and hates, and preferred mind-altering substances. But while music soothes the savage beast, it has also been known to seriously piss people off. So, today we're tuning into some famous songs with surprising controversies. Before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other musical topics you'd like to hear about. Okay, DJ Weird History is on the ones and twos. In the Air Tonight was Phil Collins' first single as a solo artist post-Genesis. It quickly drummed its way up the charts, ensuring Collins' fame and sparking any number of goofy urban legends surrounding the song's cryptic lyrics. The most popular rumor is that the song is a real-life account of Phil witnessing what was essentially a murder, but being unable to do anything about it at the time for some reason. Writing a haunted minor key song is not the same as calling 911, Phil. The truth is, it was about his divorce from wife Andrea Bertarelli the previous year, making that whole story about getting revenge on a person who let someone else drown sound extra silly. It was basically just Phil writing stream of consciousness breakup poetry. But the reason the song got banned during the Gulf War is even sillier. Radio stations axed it over concern that some people would misinterpret the lyrics and equate them with Scud missiles flying in the air tonight. Of course, there's nothing in the song remotely related to violence or warfare outside of the raging battle taking place within Phil's broken heart, but war tends to make people jumpy. So sorry, Phil, we'll see you on the Tarzan soundtrack. Fligga-goo-goo, fligga-goo-goo. Link Wray's Rumble is one of those guitar instrumentals you've probably heard dozens of times without knowing what it was called or who wrote it. It's in every movie ever made about gangs or street fights, and Iggy Pop noted that the song's influence, quote, prefigured everything you heard after from AC/DC, the West Coast glam bands, and punk rock. Smart guy, but will he ever put on a shirt? You must be chilly, Iggy. Still, despite Rumble being just a cool melody that by definition cannot include anything remotely controversial, radio stations around the country banned the song in the late 1950s, and it remains the only instrumental track ever forbidden from the airwaves. But why? Well, New York and Boston stations wouldn't play it specifically for fear of inciting gang violence. However, given that the song has no lyrics at all, it's hard not to conclude that the only problem with the song is that it's called Rumble. If Ray had given it a less threatening title, like, I don't know, Handshake or Big Hug or something, much of rock and roll history might have been completely different. The eternally raspy Rod Stewart dropped his version of the Sutherland Brothers' classic tune Sailing in 1975. While nobody had a problem with it when Stewart recorded it, the BBC banned it about a decade later due to a conflict between the UK and Argentina. On the third day of the Falklands War, Stewart's Sailing was broadcast from a PA system, and soon after, the BBC took it off the air. If you listen to the lyrics, the song has nothing to do with the Falklands conflict, or any conflict for that matter. So what gives? The problem the BBC had was simply that sailing presented a positive view of life on the sea, and during a conflict full of maritime battles, they thought it was a bit too cheeky. Your reckless fondness for the ocean has put this nation at risk, Ro. Thy song is banned. It's hard to think of a band more wholesome than the Beach Boys, except for the whole Manson thing. But one of their tracks still managed to upset enough people in the American South that radio stations in the 1960s felt the need to keep it from the airwaves. God Only Knows was released on the band's 1966 album Pet Sounds and is considered one of their greatest songs, if not one of the best pop songs of the 20th century, which is saying something. Paul McCartney, a pretty good musician in his own right, said, quote, "It's one of the few songs that reduces me to tears every time I hear it. It's really just a love song, but it's brilliantly done." So why did this masterpiece, which was written by Brian Wilson and Tony Asher, get booted off the radio? Well, the title presented a problem for radio stations in the devoutly religious southern United States. Asher saw this coming, saying, unless you were Katie Smith and you were saying God Bless America, no one thought you could say God in a song. No one had done it, and Brian didn't want to be the first person to try it. He said, we'll just never get any airplay. Guess they should have stuck to surfing. Or that little old lady from Pasadena. Van Morrison released Brown-Eyed Girl as a single in March 1967, and it quickly rose through the charts, becoming one of Morrison's best-known songs. You've probably heard it, and there's an even money chance you know some of the words, even if it's just the la la la's. But several radio stations had a problem with a different line in the song. Making Love in the Green Grass made more than a few broadcasters clutch their pearls, but not for the reason you might think. After all, this was the late 1960s. Elvis had already gyrated his way through the Ed Sullivan Show more than a decade earlier. Overt references to sex in mainstream American culture were becoming less of a big deal, and Sir Van's lyric is pretty darn chaste, all things considered. Yes, he is a knight. The problem radio stations had with the lyric was that it reportedly referred to an interracial couple, which pushed the limits of what they considered to be socially acceptable at the time. Apparently, the song was originally titled Brown-Skinned Girl for a few takes on the day it was recorded, and that was enough to get it banned from more than a few stations. The Kinks released Lola in 1970. It quickly became a hit, one of the band's signature songs, and the inspiration for the Weird Al classic Yoda. However, despite its undeniable success and influence, the song was once banned by the BBC. If you're unfamiliar with it, the lyrics detail a romantic encounter between a man and a trans woman, so you might assume that was the focal point of the controversy. But that wasn't the issue. The BBC brought its mighty ban hammer down upon the Kinks because Lola contained a reference to Coca-Cola. The broadcaster considered this to be embedded advertising for the soft drink, so the band had to re-record the song without naming the popular drink. The modified version refers to a generic cherry cola instead of Coca-Cola. And honestly, that makes for a tastier jam. People always try to put The Who down, but not because they didn't like My Generation, one of the group's most popular tracks and one of the most celebrated rock songs of all time. Instead, the otherwise acclaimed tune was banned for its inclusion of stuttering. If you listen to the lyrics, you can easily hear Roger Daltrey stuttering through several words. The BBC thus banned My Generation from its airwaves because it was considered offensive to people with a legitimate stutter. Ultimately, the BBC relented and removed the ban, as the song's popularity essentially demanded it receive radio play. According to Pete Townsend, the stutter wasn't intended as a dig at people with a speech disorder. It was a tribute to the vocal style of Sonny Boy Williamson II, a bluesman who had opened for The Who on several occasions. In 1963, the Kingsmen released their version of Richard Berry's Louie, Louie. The song was a massive hit and a boon to guitarists all over the world who only knew how to play 3 chords, which is most of us. Louie Louie tells the story of a Jamaican sailor returning home to see his lover. Nothing in the lyrics is overtly offensive, but the song still found itself on the no playlist after 2 massively square Indiana teenagers took offense. They wrote a letter to Governor Matthew Welsh, who listened to the lyrics and agreed there was something dirty about it. So he contacted the FCC and the Indiana Broadcasters Association, requesting Louie Louie be removed from broadcast. Almost immediately, the song was investigated by the FCC, the U.S. Postal Service, the U.S. Justice Department, and even the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover must have been having a slow day. The 2 dork-ass teens wrote a follow-up letter to Welsh, thanking him for his swift action and saying, "Much is written about the declining morals of the American teenager. However, most people don't realize that if the morals are declining, it is because of smut such as this record, put out by adults whose only concern is making a fast buck." Again, smut that nobody could actually put their finger on. The ban only made the song seem dangerous, thereby boosting sales and pushing the Kingsmen to new heights. Elvis Costello's Radio Radio debuted as a single in 1978, but he performed it with his band The Attractions on Saturday Night Live in 1977. Even though the nascent comedy show was designed to push the limits, the performance created some controversy. Why? Well, Costello was supposed to perform less than 0, but switched songs live like a quarterback calling an audible and jammed out Radio Radio instead, upsetting both his record company and SNL, who banned him from returning. The show has a history of banning people for various reasons, and while most bans aren't lifted, eventually Costello was allowed back on. In a later interview, he reflected on how it all went down, saying, quote, "We did end up on Saturday Night Live, and I just wanted them to remember us. I didn't really have anything against the show. I was more pissed off at being told what to play by the record company than I was NBC, truthfully." In other words, Costello said, no less than 0, only Radio Radio. The Beatles' music was no stranger to controversy, but the songs people got their mop tops all ruffled over didn't always make sense. That's especially true of A Day in the Life, the final track of the 1967 album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The BBC banned the song soon after its release, which was a controversial decision even at the time. So what gives? In May of that year, the Beatles received a letter from Frank Gillard, the director of BBC Sound Broadcasting, stating that he couldn't avoid coming to the conclusion that the words "I'd love to turn you on," followed by a crescendoing montage of sound, could have a sinister meaning. Gillard laid it on thick, telling the Fab Four, "I never thought the day would come when we would have to put a ban on an EMI record, but sadly, this is what has happened over this track." The BBC continued, "The recording may have been made in innocence and good faith, but they had to take account for the interpretation they felt many young people would inevitably put upon it. And while 'turned on' was a phrase used in many different circumstances, it was, at the time, part of drug culture jargon." In case you've been living in a yellow submarine for the past half-century, the Beatles were already well known for experimenting with drugs, so the BBC was on alert for any lyrics that seemed to promote this counterculture. But John Lennon rebuffed the insinuation and insisted the track and its lines had nothing to do with substance abuse. Instead, he said he was reading the newspaper one day and saw a story about Tara Brown, the Guinness heir who lost her life in a London car crash. On the next page was a story about 4,000 potholes in the streets of Blackburn, Lancashire, that needed to be filled, and the lyrics came a-flowing. As for the offensive line, "I'd love to turn you on," Lennon described it as Paul McCartney's contribution. And while you can hardly blame him for trying to blame it on Paul, for what it's worth, Lennon added, "and it was a damn good piece of work." So what do you think? Did any of these songs deserve to get banned? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from Weird History.